Konferensen kommer ju ha mycket nordiskt perspektiv, men nu blir det europeiska perspektiv. What is the role of cultural planning strategies in enhancing local quality of life? Welcome, Mr. Franco Bianchini. And you're a professor of a cultural policy and planning school of cultural studies and humanities in Leeds, Leeds Metropolitan University. And very welcome. And the floor is yours. And you said before that you're going to have some questions after your lecture. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Very welcome.
Is it? It's not. Yeah, okay. Great. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, probably I missed something in the previous speeches, but I tried to understand, and I was helped a little bit by my neighbor. I will try to talk about a debate on cultural planning, which luckily, fortunately for Scandinavian countries, seems to be going better and being more advanced and being taken more seriously in these countries than in the UK. Although clearly the UK had an important role in beginning to spread these ideas of cultural planning in Europe. Ideas which were probably generated in Europe itself, but were developed, as you will see later, in the US, mainly in the United States, in the 1970s. Quality of life is a question which is on the table also for this discussion today, and it is an interesting concept, and it is very much at the heart of strategies also for competitiveness between cities. Quality of life is often projected as the key thing which is needed for a city or for a region to attract investment, to attract mobile talent. But there is often a limited understanding of what it is, of what quality of life is. Usually, quality of life studies are based on, first of all, an analysis of the objective quality of certain services, certain urban services, like transport, health services, housing, schools, the quality of universities, and also on opinion surveys, surveys of opinion about what people think of the different services and of the quality of cities. What is missing and what sometimes produces relatively absurd results is the experience of the city as a collective entity. So you can have sometimes cities where nobody would live and which are extremely boring places, for example in the UK, scoring higher than cities which on the other hand are vibrant, lively, that are characterized by a strong sense of belonging and which give you a buzz and places in which you want to actually live because they are interesting and you feel you can grow. So I would say that there are very serious limitations to existing quality of life studies, and that they need themselves, if you like, a cultural corrective, a kind of cultural planning intervention. But moving on quickly to cultural planning, it is not a new idea at all. If we interpret as cultural planning the creation of public spaces or buildings for cultural use, cultural and civic use, and if we intend as cultural planning the integration of an artistic perspective into physical planning, we can say that although this was clearly limited to a small number of citizens, because we are clearly talking about societies in which slavery was still in existence, that cultural planning in a way was already present in ancient civilizations, probably even before ancient Greece, but certainly in the ancient Greek city, in the polis, probably in the Roman Empire, probably also in cities, in the city-states in the Italian Middle Ages and in the Renaissance. For example, the city of Siena in Tuscany, as early as 1309, already had municipal statutes which were prescribing aesthetic standards for the quality of buildings and public spaces. But nevertheless, cultural planning in the modern form, cultural planning for democratic countries or for the beginning of the construction of democratic countries really only emerges, like many other things, in the 19th century, towards the end of the 19th century, through the work of a very interesting figure, a Scottish botanist, but also biologist, but also sociologist. He had studied with Auguste Comte in France, in Paris. He spoke French fluently. He had also studied with Élisée Reclus, who was an anarchist who started one of the most important geography schools in France at the time, and a planner. So Geddes, with his colleagues in Edinburgh, was involved in actually starting the modern town planning movement in Britain, was very influential on the garden city idea. It was very influential also on Lewis Mumford, who was effectively one of his disciples. So Geddes is revolutionary in many ways. He has been described as a generalist, as a Scottish generalist. And it is one of the characteristics of the Scottish education system, by comparison with the English education system, that it is more generalist, that it looks at the connections between different disciplines more, and it encourages children to specialize later. That is also a characteristic, incidentally, of some continental European education systems, including certainly the Italian system. It is one of the perhaps few good things about the Italian education systems. But one of the things that Geddes said was that you cannot plan if you first don't do a survey. And his idea of the survey was broader than the idea of the survey still normally is in physical planning, even today, in the 21st century. Because today, when we do a survey before building, for example, a shopping center or building a new housing district in a city, often we limit ourselves to a narrow notion of survey, even today. We survey the environmental and geological characteristics of an area. Not always we survey the totality of what Geddes was defining as folk, work, and place. Work is the characteristics of the economy, both the formal and informal economy. So what people do to make a living in a place, and what people could do in the future to make a living. Folk is what people do and what they believe in, what they engage in their free time. How do they express their creativity and their spirituality as well? So it is religious beliefs, it is, but it is also traditions of social life, pastimes, hobbies, enthusiasms. Culture clearly comes into it, creativity, but also the tangible and intangible heritage of a place. And place itself, for Geddes, very interestingly, includes not only the physical and built environment, but also, because he was a botanist, flora and fauna, so the animals, the flowers, the plants, life, the ecosystems of a place, the geology of a place, and the weather. The weather is very important for him. He specifically says that any plan has to include meteorological characteristics. So I think what he's producing, it is something that it is far broader than the kind of survey that we have today. And and I think it is far broader than even a lot of cultural planning, a lot of existing cultural planning surveys. This thinking of Geddes is incorporated in the Outlook Tower, which is a sort of symbolic building that he created in Edinburgh. And as you walk up this tower, you can see more and more different aspects of the city of Edinburgh as you walk up the spiral staircase, and then you get to the top and you actually see the real city. But you have been prepared, in a sense, by your progress up the stairs to the top of the tower. So if you go to Edinburgh, it's an interesting, for cultural planners, I would say, it's probably a due visit, that something you must visit. Also, Geddes was very important in linking the idea of the survey with civic renewal, with the idea of building new citizens. And this is inaugurated an important strand of cultural planning, which I am slightly uneasy about, because I'm slightly more libertarian than people who advocate this, but nevertheless, it's an important one, linking cultural planning with the development of citizenship. The role of the state in almost setting standards of behavior for people and encouraging people through engagement in cultural activities broadly defined to change their behavior in personally and socially useful ways. So anyway, it is quite interesting that since Geddes, in a way, we have not really progressed that much in many ways in cultural planning. But nevertheless, these ideas were largely forgotten in many ways and interpreted fairly narrowly in future. The Garden City movement itself interpreted the ideas of Geddes in a relatively narrow way. So in many ways did other movements which did integrate art into urbanism, but did not do that kind of complex and interdisciplinary survey that, that Geddes advocated. For example, the Chicago City Beautiful Plan of 1909, the Bauhaus movement itself, some experiments in the US in the New Deal under President Roosevelt in the late 1930s. There was a kind of fairly narrow interpretation of aspects of Geddes' ideas, filtered often through the ideas of other thinkers like Louis Mumford himself. Nevertheless, cultural planning in a form which you can recognize today in Scandinavian countries much more, re-emerges from the mid-1970s in the US. And this is a time in the US when there is a lot of urban regeneration, and American city mayors look at the arts in particular as a useful regenerator for declining downtown areas. This is because the National Endowment for the Arts had begun to offer substantial subsidy for arts organizations. So arts organizations were looking for new homes, property developers were looking for profits, and city mayors were looking for regeneration. So there was a kind of marriage, if you can call it a marriage, because it's actually three things, but so anyway, a kind of ménage à trois, let's say, of these three interests coming together, and which produced a sort of regeneration or beginning of a regeneration of American cities. In this context, Bob McNulty set up an organization which campaigned for cultural planning. It is called Partners for Livable Places. It's based in Washington, still exists, although now the word places has been replaced with the word communities. So it is now called Partners for Livable Communities. The idea of quality of life was very much in there, in the idea of livability. Yeah? Livability. They campaigned for livability, but they also campaigned for rather horrible American word, beautification. So often involving artists and public art in making places more beautiful, which was often criticized as being very reductive. Some critics criticized the use of public art in the US in this period as applying the lipstick on the gorilla. So the use of public art as decoration at the last minute just to desperately beautify something which is planned in a way which is historically and culturally insensitive. By the way, lipstick on the gorilla is in a way offensive to gorillas. It sort of implies that gorillas are not beautiful, but that's a long debate. The issue was developed through a series of books as well. There was a book called The Art of City Planning, published in 1980, which included a really important, in my view, chapter by an American journalist, Wolf von Eckert, who actually formulated cultural planning in a more modern way, developing the idea of someone called Harvey Perloff, who was one of the collaborators of Bob McNulty. And von Eckert in this chapter says that if you want to have an effective cultural policy, he was still using the word cultural policy, you need to understand many different arts. One of them is the art of transportation planning. Another one is the art of guaranteeing public safety. Another one is the art of community development. So he was basically arguing that a cultural policy cannot work if it is not supported by a range of different strategies which go from lighting to policing to public transport to pedestrianization and all sorts of other strategies. So it was beginning really to develop the modern conception of cultural planning. And after that, I was influenced by these ideas myself. I discovered them in 1988, or 87, 88, as the British American Arts Association organized a conference in the UK, in Glasgow, called Arts and the Changing City. And I was, I think, the first person to introduce the term cultural planning in the UK, and it was then from the UK imported into Australia by Colin Mercer and other writers. In the UK, it generated a range of different debates in which the independent research center, Comedia, was very involved, including the idea of cultural industry strategies, which we developed in the early 1990s, the rediscovery of the nighttime economy of cities, the debate on the creative city, which is closely linked with cultural planning, the idea of the intercultural city, which is working particularly in cities with multi-ethnic populations and looking at that as an asset rather than just a problem, which is the tendency in a lot of more right-wing populist discourse in Europe at the moment. The work of Lia Ghilardi and Noema, who has been really important, particularly in Sweden, and has, I think, contributed to spreading the idea of cultural planning in Sweden in particular. And the beginning of the first MA courses in cultural planning, including, I started the first one in the UK, I think in Europe, which doesn't exist anymore because I don't work at that university anymore, in 1995 at De Montfort University in Leicester. Colin Mercer in Australia at the same time used cultural planning as part of the development of integrated local area plans, or ILAPs, which in a way is still an interesting model, it's still an important model, and it is still influencing thinking. You have the idea there that cultural planning is, there should be really a cultural planner working together with perhaps a transport specialist, working together with an urban designer, working with an economist. So there should be a collaboration of these different specialisms to produce a plan, a strategic plan, which is not just about infrastructure and not just about the economy, but which also looks seriously at the cultural and heritage resources of a place. The idea of cultural planning later also spread in other countries. It is now strong in Canada, particularly through the work of the Creative City Network in Canada and the work of Greg Baker, who is a consultant, an expert. And it is also present clearly in New Zealand, South Africa, under different names also in other countries. The problem of cultural planning, there are many problems, but one of the problems is that Often people use the word cultural plan, but in reality you go and look, and it is essentially an old-fashioned arts plan. It does not embrace the totality of the cultural resources of a place in an anthropological sense, in the same way that people use the word creative city strategy, but in reality you look at it more closely and it is simply a cultural industries or creative industry strategy. It is not a creative city strategy. So this is really does a disservice to the idea both of cultural planning and of the creative city. The idea of the creative city, I haven't talked about it in detail, but essentially we developed it with Charles Landry in 1995 when we wrote a short book called The Creative City, precisely, that then later Landry developed into a much longer book, also called The Creative City, which has meant that the short book has been completely forgotten. But nevertheless, the idea of the creative city was simply that we reflected on psychological research on creativity in individuals and small groups and organizations. And we tried to understand if some of the lessons from this research could be applied to the working of a city, to urban policy, urban strategy. And we concluded that yes, several of these lessons could be useful in increasing levels of creativity and creative working in different aspects of urban strategy, and we made a series of recommendations on how really different kinds of public policy could be made more creative. As you can see, it is a very broad strategy which cannot be reduced to the much smaller task of developing a strategy for the creative industry sector. The creative city strategy has a relevance for education, it has implications for transport, for ecology, for health, for absolutely everything. So that was the original idea. It is certainly not something that you can reduce, in my view, simply to a creative industries strategy. And UNESCO itself, through its Creative City program, which is a world program, have contributed to the confusion, because in a sense the Creative City program of UNESCO now is largely about creative industries. It is fairly narrow. So that's really one of the problems that we face, and I think this is one of the key reasons why both cultural planning and the creative city as ideas are misunderstood. Anyway, looking at some interpretations of cultural planning, the first one is mine, is essentially, in my view, is a way of thinking culturally and even artistically about public policy. It's a culturally sensitive approach to urban and regional planning and to every kind of environmental, social and economic policy making. It is about creating a two-way relationship between cultural resources and public policy. A relationship in which people who are in charge of cultural mapping, of mapping cultural resources, and cultural mapping is a key term here, should be able also to influence public policy, should not just be influenced by it, but it should be a dialogue between equals. Colin Mercer defines it as the strategic and integral planning and use of cultural resources for urban and community development. Is a fairly similar definition in many ways. He advocates that cultural resources should be integral to urban policy processes, should not be appended as an afterthought. Other writers like Graham Evans have contributed to some extent to the confusion because they use the word cultural planning. He has written probably one of the most widely quoted books about cultural planning, which is called Cultural Planning itself. But in his book, essentially, he defines cultural planning as, Leah Ghilardi says jokingly, cultural plumbing, as the planning of cultural infrastructure or the setting of standards for the provision of cultural amenities. This, is in my view, is a very reductive and fairly narrow interpretation, but that is also what is used often when talking about cultural planning. Other different interpretations. Colin Mercer himself has insisted very much on the importance of cultural planning for the development of citizenship, linking it with the idea of governmentality, which is an idea of Foucault, although in my view is a kind of misreading of Foucault. but anyway, a little bit complicated, but essentially the idea that cultural planning is also a strategy for encouraging people to adopt more constructive forms of behavior, including diet, including basically physical activity, levels of physical activity and fitness, including avoiding teenage pregnancies and other things like this. So there is a strand of thought in cultural planning which very much sees the role of cultural planning, the work of artists in communities, particularly in deprived communities, as a way of changing people's behaviors in socially constructive and useful ways. Other people say that the word cultural planning sounds a little bit too heavy and prefer to use the word planning culturally. This is, for example, the proposal made in the very interesting book by Richard Brecknock, an Australian designer and community artist. The book is called More Than Just a Bridge. The book is looking at cultural planning more at the level of design, so designing buildings, physical planning, but it is an interesting book and it is an interesting proposal. UNESCO and the EU recently prefer to use the term culture-based local development rather than cultural planning. But largely it is similar, although one of the interesting things in this debate, perhaps because the writings on cultural planning are a little bit difficult to find, is that people are constantly reinventing the wheel. For example, it happens a lot to me that my own words are quoted, something I've written in 1989 is quoted, attributed to somebody else, as if and written in 2006, 2007, 2008. So there is a lot of plagiarism, there is a lot of constant reinventing the wheel, people suddenly discovering something which has been talked about, in some cases by Geddes in the 1890s. So it is curious. So there is a real problem of a lack of books, a lack of, which is obviously, you know, I'm at fault here. We have been quite lazy in producing the literature, the courses, the instruments to actually clarify some of the confusion that exists in this field. And I think in this, again, the Canadians have been much better in a way. And then there is artist-led cultural planning, which is another thing, which I will talk a little bit more in detail. This artist-led cultural planning, I've been kind of struck by an article which is available on the internet by Jonathan Metzger. He's not here, he's not. He's from Sweden himself. He works in Stockholm, an academic, who, does anybody know him? By the way, I don't know him, but yeah. Who writes that in Swedish, the noun, the word for art, konst, derives from the same linguistic root as the adjective strange, which is konstig. And he quotes the Swedish artist Lars Nilsson, who plays on this double meaning when he says that art, konst, must never be useful, but on the other hand, it must be allowed to be artful, to be strange, to be konstig. So in his comment, Metzger says that Nilsson enacts the commonly posited binary opposite between utility and artistry, staging these terms as mutually excluding opposites. But Metzger, on the other hand, and I agree with Metzger, he argues that on the contrary, art and artist-led activities, in fact, can be very useful and actually function as a powerful vehicle of communication in the planning process, precisely because of the artistic license that grants the artist a mandate to set the stage for an estrangement of that which is familiar and taken for granted, thus shifting the frames of reference and creating a radical potential for planning in a way which can be very difficult for planners to achieve on their own. Okay? So So he wants to shift focus away simply from art in the public sphere and try to generate a discussion about art as a public sphere. So that's a very important point. So this positing, this idea that art, because it is strange, it causes estrangement, it actually is not useful, is completely wrong. It is useful precisely because it forces us to ask different questions, difficult questions, questions which are often not asked by specialists. So one of the important things about artists, or at least the more interesting artists, is that, like Patrick Geddes, they are generalists, they are not specialists. As John Latham, the British artist who now dead, as John Latham said in the 1970s, the artist is often an incidental person. It is someone who is, precisely because of not being a non-specialist, is able to ask the questions that specialists do not ask. And that's where the validity of art in planning and public policy processes lies. Latham started an artist placement group, or APG, in the 1970s, which was very important in terms of innovative thinking in a range of different areas. And it involved the placing of artists in different organizations like British Gas, for example, or other energy companies, infrastructural works, and so on. This kind of thinking about the lateral nature of artist-led cultural planning is embodied in a range of different projects. One of them is Città dell'Arte in Biella, not far from Turin, in Italy, which is a former textiles factory renovated and put back into use by a visual artist, Michelangelo Pistoletto, one of the leading artists of the arte povera, or poor art movement of the late 60s, early 70s, who has used this revamped, reused factory as a laboratory for young artists from all over Europe and beyond, usually supported by scholarships from different countries, to work there in collaboration with different interests in the area. So, for example, there is a group working on education issues, another one on ecology, a third group working on economy and work, working, for example, with the local chambers of commerce, businesses, and trying to produce innovative solutions to different problems. One group is even working on trying to find a solution to the Israeli-Palestine conflict, which is perhaps a little bit too ambitious, but anyway, it's an interesting project, and if you go to the website, they have a lot of material in English they're trying to do. This artist-led cultural planning, inspired by artistic thinking, has led to interesting experiments. For example, in the area of urban lighting, there is a festival in Turin called Luci d'Artista, or Artists' Lights, which is essentially a much more clever and innovative use of the Christmas lights budget, and tries to transform the city into an open-air art gallery during the Christmas period. The same kind of principles have been used by the lighting strategy of the city of Lyon in France, where artists have worked together with engineers and planners, by the invention of the Vallonvoimat festival in Helsinki, by the creation of a series of light nights in different cities, celebrating light also artistically. One of them is in the city where I work, in Leeds, in northern England. And also in a book, an interesting book by Zenobia Radzis called Reflections on Urban Lighting. So this is an example of a project. This is a project for Essen, Essen for the Ruhr, European Capital of Culture 2010. An illumination of a factory in Duisburg, which could be an eyesore, but it perhaps still is, but nevertheless it becomes a kind of iconic marker in an industrial landscape in this part of the Ruhr. And this is a picture from the Lucida Artista project in Turin. I think it's Via Po in Turin. Nothing amazing, but it is better than your usual Father Christmas and the red-nosed reindeer, snowman. It is a bit more imaginative, and yes, and probably it costs the same. Cultural planning is also, like the creative city approach itself, is very much also about opening up policy systems to young talent, setting up pilot projects, research and development budgets, taking a more mature attitude to the idea of success and failure, not being paralyzed by the fear of failure, which is completely paralyzing everything, certainly in the UK now, because there is a climate of austerity and cuts. All budgets for experiments have been cut. This is also why training courses have been cut, visits to what the British call Europe, because they are not part of Europe, of course, and they are not available anymore to anybody, and also courses in cultural planning have virtually completely disappeared. Precisely at the time when we need to reinvent an economic base for Europe, precisely at the time when we have 20% unemployment in several cities in the UK, in some cases even more, 23% in Spain. I don't know in Sweden how much, but it is quite high even here. So it just doesn't make sense, but that is what the current ethos of austerity dictates. It is not rational. It's almost like, I wouldn't know even how to define it, but it's almost like a knee-jerk reaction in a way. Another characteristic, in my view, of cultural planning is that it is critical and questioning and challenging. It is a valid approach, in my view, because it actually looks, when you do cultural mapping, when you do a mapping of the cultural resources of a city or of a region, you also need to look at the difficult areas. You need to look at the taboo areas, at the skeletons in the cupboard, at the contradictions, at the problems, because it is often in the conflicts and problems that the most interesting resources are. That's where they are. Linz, European Capital of Culture 2009, discovered this when, through the work of their artistic director, interestingly a Swiss, Martin Heller, not from Austria, they had the courage to explore the Hitler legacy for the city. Hitler was born near Linz. He had a vision of Linz as a small cultural capital, and he asked Albert Speer, his favorite architect, to design a series of major cultural buildings for Linz. And as you can imagine, the tendency in Linz and in many Austrian cities had been always to forget about this, to try to not to talk about this difficult past, and to always look at the future. This is why Linz, for instance, has invested a lot in electronic art, with the Arts Electronica Festival and museums. But for the first time, really, as part of the program of Linz European Capital of Culture, they had the courage really to explore this. It was important for schools, for children, for the growth of the city, civic growth of the city, but it was also important for the media and for cultural tourism, and it is one of the most remembered aspects of the artistic program of Linz European Capital of Culture 2009. We could make many other examples of this kind. Another one is the recent opening of a mafia museum in Salemi in Sicily, which in the intentions of the people who have created these museums will be useful, again, educationally, perhaps as a tourism asset, although it doesn't always work because an equivalent museum in Mexico City has become part of the induction program for new criminals who have to visit it and then have to answer questions on a quiz as part of the as part of the induction program, to join one of the main cartels of the narcos in Mexico, the Zetas or the Veracruz cartel. There is a variety of different. There is an exam to join, and you have to visit the museum. So I hope that doesn't happen also to the Mafia Museum in Sicily. Now, the other thing about cultural planning is that it is, in my view, it's a cultured approach. So we have to, I think as cultural planners or mappers, we have to not be afraid of being cultured, which is often a problem, especially in the UK. It's another thing I hate about England is that if you say you are cultured, immediately people assume you are a toff, you are posh. There is a class connotation with the idea of being cultured, of knowing about the history of a place. Actually, it shouldn't be like that. I think you have a duty to be cultured if you work for a local authority and you are in charge of developing a cultural programming for a local authority. You need to know about the history. It's not good enough if your city is 1,000 years old. You need to know about all the history, not just about what's happening in the last 20 years. Because motives, narratives, which have been present in history still have a subterranean relevance even today. They're never completely dead. There is a continuity. Even if we have done our best to destroy our past, to obliterate it, especially in many Northern European countries, there has been, unfortunately, a loss of a lot of tangible heritage. Nevertheless, that history is still there. It stubbornly refuses to go away completely. So I think it's very important to do this kind of cartography, which is a cultured cartography, which involves a collaboration with historians, with archaeologists, with academics of different kinds, and even with people, with people's memories, with oral histories, reminiscences. And from that, you can also draw inspiration for future creative ideas. So learning about traditions of creativity and innovation can actually inspire new traditions. For example, the city of Aberdeen in Scotland, if I was them and I was developing their cultural policy, I would clearly look at their enlightenment in the late 18th century. And I think they haven't done anything as good as that since then. And so I'm trying to build a new enlightenment, trying to understand how did they have that amazing season of enlightenment then, and why hasn't it happened since then? What were the conditions? What is left there that could be reactivated? Might be interesting. This kind of approach, this cultured approach and collaborative approach has inspired some thinking around place marketing. For instance, the book by Chris Murray, Making Sense of Place, where he argues that city marketing is often interpreted very reductively as the designing and selling of place identities. This is what Philip Kotler, one of the gurus of place marketing, tells you. That basically place marketing is essentially about designing and selling the identity of a place as you would do for any product. What Chris Murray says, on the other hand, is that we need to adopt a much more artistic approach to this. What place marketing should do from a cultural planning perspective is to reveal and discover the existing complex identities of a place rather than to design and sell the identity of a place. So a different approach. So this gives you an idea of how cultural planning can actually innovate thinking in a particular policy areas, in this case, place marketing. Murray goes on to demonstrate how existing place marketing doesn't work by doing a survey of about 75 place marketing campaigns by different local authorities in the UK, and he finds, for example, that they are dominating by fairly similar ideas. In virtually the vast majority of campaigns, for example, people are described as friendly as opposed to other references, 163 references to friendly, 15 to anything else, which is a bit unimaginative. Or everybody talks about uniqueness, 218 references, but only about sort of 60 out of 218 explain what is this uniqueness consists of. So this is why it is important to do cultural mapping and cartography, to give you a bit of evidence, something to talk about, to justify your claims also about uniqueness and specificity. So Murray also suggests that in order to do place marketing, city marketing, from a cultural planning perspective, you need much more participation of ordinary people in the place, in the city, and you also need an element of retraining of professionals, which involves integration of knowledge. The knowledges of journalists, of artists, of semiologists, anthropologists, of specialists of different aspects, including historians, have to work together with marketing specialists. You cannot expect the marketing specialist to be parachuted into a place and develop a convincing, sustainable narrative without doing that kind of work of integration. So there are many inspiring initiatives in European cities. Some of them don't describe themselves as cultural planning, but in a sense they are. I've already talked about lighting. There are many initiatives around festivals which are important, trying to recreate a public sphere of debate with unusual festivals. There is a strong festival of journalism in Perugia, in central Italy. There is a festival of philosophy in Modena, again not far from Bologna, again in Italy. There are also in other cases examples of trying to create a public sphere through insertion of innovative architecture in historic environments. In Graz, in Austria, for instance, the creation of an artificial island on the river Mur, designed by the American installation artist Vito Acconci. In other cases, attempts to insert modern transportation systems into historic environments, again to facilitate communication between different parts of the city, or linking of art with new technology in an interesting way, as in the case of the ZKM Center in Karlsruhe in Germany, which is run by scientists and artists working together, and often developing innovative products which are inspired by scientific research and artistic research collaborating. I got some out of focus pictures here. This is a picture of the Kunsthaus in Graz, a rather almost like a slug inserted into the historic center of the city. And this is a picture of escalators, which you can't see very well, inside the Rocca Paolina in Perugia, in Umbria, in central Italy. Essentially, this is a doubly interesting intervention. The recovery of a kind of castle, which is inside the city, which is used as a way of going through the city itself and inserting these escalators inside the actual structures of this castle. There are many interesting experiments of cultural planning in rural areas as well. Probably you can look, for instance, at the work of Greg Baker in Canada and his idea of the creative rural economy, or the work of Littoral and the Rural Cultural Forum, for instance, in the UK. Clearly, cultural planning does not substitute cultural policy. The two approaches are complementary. You need to continue to have specialists in cultural policy, in theater policy, in dance, in film, in literature, but they need to work together with cultural planners. The two approaches are definitely complementary. Cultural planning is based on a broad definition of cultural resources. I don't need to reiterate that, which goes from arts and media activities to through to the tangible and intangible heritage, places for sociability, and also the intellectual and scientific milieu in a city, including also the universities, other places where research is conducted. each of these different elements, for example, the image bank of a place can be deconstructed further. For example, the local image bank constitutes all these different elements, and very few cities have got an accurate mapping or cartography of these components of their image bank. We also need to understand that these resources are contested. For instance, if we look at image and local mindscapes and imaginaries, there is a politics of symbolic contestation in each place. The view about what is the most important narrative to be promoted about a place varies in terms of age, in terms of often neighborhood, in terms of occupation, gender. There are many different variations, and we need to acknowledge those. We need to resist the temptation of producing official mindscapes or imaginaries which are based only on a dominant view. It is important to map many different assets. One of them is clearly talent, and in order to do that, you need to associate in the mapping process younger people who are much better able than people of my age, for instance, to understand where the moving current of creativity is at the moment. I certainly wouldn't know even where to start if I was asked to map innovation in music, for instance, in Leeds. I would have to work with much younger people, and this is often not understood enough, I think, in local authorities, and this is why we miss out on all sorts of assets. One example of the value of hidden assets I want to give concerns a musical instrument in near Bologna, in Budrio, which is a small town near Bologna, where they make ocarinas. Ocarina is a musical instrument made of clay, which is very unfashionable. It is played in by 7 people normally, a septet. And in Budrio, they happen to have some of the best artisans making ocarina, and they have one of the best septets in the world, and also one of the most important ocarina festivals. Until recently, this was regarded as something really of no value, something which was going to die, essentially, because nobody in Italy seems to be interested anymore in playing ocarina. But they've recently discovered that it is one of the most popular musical instruments in South Korea, Japan, and China. So the region of Emilia-Romagna, no less, has now made ocarina as one of the most important vehicles for internationalization, for their international strategy. So they take this septet to all visits to Japan, South Korea, and China. So this is why it is important to look at these local cultural assets from an international global perspective always, because you never know what could be of value internationally. And you know, you can bet that, I'll just come to the end of the presentation, you can bet there is something really that somebody somewhere in the world is going to be interested in it. Yeah. There was a whole section here on intercultural exchange, on intercultural innovation and multi-ethnicity as an asset which can develop if somebody asks any questions later. But I just wanted to conclude with some really final thoughts about the crisis. We are living through the economic crisis that hasn't hit Sweden as hard as other countries, but I think it is definitely what everybody is talking about in many other European countries. So there is no doubt, as I said, that there is a low political status for culture. Cultural planning and the creative city as experimental approaches are being largely marginalized, certainly in the UK. There is also a limitations of advocacy based on impact research. We have very sophisticated economic and social impact research in the UK, but it seems to be disregarded, largely neglected and disregarded. So what we need, I think, is political mobilization much more. We need a political strategy. I'm personally always been not active, but sympathetic to the left. And I do believe that we do need
new forms of alliances, certainly the cultural planning movement, without linking itself explicitly to left parties, but does need to look for alliances with green thinking and with emerging forms of thinking about alternatives to finance-led capitalism as it is presently constituted. It doesn't work, and it is increasingly recognized by the capitalists themselves, including the Financial Times, that it doesn't work. So we do need to engage in this debate about a new economic model. Otherwise, cultural planning, I think, will continue to be marginalized. We also need to campaign for this at European level much more. It is disappointing not to find creative city and cultural planning debates sufficiently represented by European NGOs like Culture Action Europe, which at the moment seems to be focusing on a campaign for an increased budget for culture at European level. So maybe a different NGO, that could be an interesting project for people like Christina or others, should be created perhaps at European level to campaign for this. Maybe starting from the Nordic countries where there is already awareness of the importance of this in more than one country. There is also, I think, a need for specific training. Maybe if you say cultural planning, creating a cultural planner as a profession, maybe it's too big. Maybe we need to also have specific forms of training around cultural mapping or cartography, around intercultural mediation, working for cultural in cultural planning terms in a multi-ethnic situation. Maybe people who work in linking cultural planning with social policy. Perhaps people who link cultural planning with place marketing. So there is a range of different possibilities here. Another issue, in my view, is not only to create effective, horizontal and flexible institutional arrangements which allow you to implement cultural planning strategies, but also always to contextualize your mapping of cultural resources in international terms. It is going to be very difficult to resort this kind of strategies in the future if we do not take an international perspective. I think the resources are going to come largely from international investment in the future. Lastly, I think some of the factors that contribute to the fragility of cultural planning experiments today are, first of all, conceptual confusion, which I already talked about. The fact that people say cultural planning, but often they simply implement a traditional arts plan. Secondly, competition for resources. The fact that in a climate of cuts, the people who campaign for funding for traditional cultural institutions are usually better linked with the media and better linked with politicians than people who are interested in cultural planning, who are more perhaps linked with grassroots organizations, who are not as powerful in media and political terms as, for example, the links that the Royal Opera House or the National Gallery or the Royal Shakespeare has in the UK, for instance. So there is now definitely in many countries a reversal to a traditional form of cultural policy precisely at the time when we need it. We don't need it. We actually need to go much broader. Lastly, I think cultural mapping, once you've done the cultural mapping, is actually difficult to use it well. You need considerable skill and a breadth of knowledge and the constitution of an interdisciplinary team in order to use cultural mapping creatively for public policy. You need to know enough about the different aspects of public policy in order to understand how the assets which have been revealed through the mapping can be used in housing, in transport, in physical planning, in economic development, in many other areas. You need to have good relationships with the specialists in these different areas of public policy. Otherwise, it's not going to work. Secondly, it's there are very few people, one of them is Trevor Davis, who is sitting there. There are very few people I know who are good at using a cultural mapping set of data for artistic programming. Because in order to use it well, you need to know who is doing what internationally in terms of exhibitions, theater performances, films, and so on. And otherwise, again, it's not going to work as well as it could. And again, for business development, I think in my view, there's absolutely no point expecting someone who has worked all his or her life in a local authority to understand how you can use the results of cultural mapping to develop a plan for enterprise development. You need to work with people who have already set up enterprises. So we need to find, in other words, one of the reasons why cultural planning so far, in my view, has not shown its potential is because we are not thinking enough about how we use the results of cultural mapping. And sometimes we expect that the same people who do cultural mapping do everything else. I don't think that is the case. I think cultural mapping produces the raw materials, and then we need other specialists to help us to implement, to develop the policies. So, nevertheless, the experience of Europe today reveals that there are massive problems not doing cultural planning. As Patrick Geddes had understood already back in the 1890s, if you don't do a good survey, you end up with wasting money and getting yourself into deep trouble, as Spanish cities are discovering at the moment, or indeed Greek cities, unfortunately. Greece spent a lot of money on fairly unsustainable sports infrastructure for the 2004 Olympics, which has contributed to its financial crisis. Spain, aided by the high level of local autonomy that Spanish cities have, which sometimes can be a good thing, but sometimes can also help you to get more into trouble, have unfortunately created many containers, many cultural containers without content and without money to have any proper cultural content. One example is the City of Arts and Science in Valencia. Another one is the so-called Niemeyer Center in Avilés in the northwest of the country. So this shows what can happen if you have a cultural policy which is not based on any notion, any serious notion of survey and of mapping. Thanks, yeah.
Oh yeah, thank you.
A small piece of art.
Oh
here.
yes, yeah.
Yes, and some chocolate. And thanks a lot.
Thanks very much.
Yes,
thank you.
Thanks a lot.
So we have the questions later.
Thanks.
Okay, sorry, it was a bit long.
Bensträckare här i rummet, och det finns tillfälle sen att ställa frågor till